Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another interview in Stay Live Streams here today. Now, today's interview is focused on the consent decree. And it's focused on the consent decree with the possibility of there being no federal oversight. As you know, December 10th in 2024, it was announced locally that the consent decree is going to be a thing. It was announced that it's going to happen. It was announced that it's coming. It was Greenberg. It was Chief Humphrey. And forgive me if I forget all the names who did speak that day, but nonetheless, what we were waiting on more than anything was the federal signing of Judge Benjamin Beaton that has yet to come. And now Donald Trump, since he's taken his seat as president, it seems that it might not happen at all. But nonetheless, the mayor here in Louisville, Kentucky, Craig Greenberg, has stated that despite the fact of what happens in the president's seat, despite the fact that what happens with the federal signing or not, he and Chief Paul Humphrey are committed to moving forward with a consent decree. Now, we have a special guest today to talk more about that, and right after this commercial break, so stay with us.
Hey y'all, I'm Attica Scott, former Kentucky State Representative, and you're joining me today on State Live Streams.
We will continue to provide updates as we have more information.
Former Kentucky State Representative, and you're joining me today on State Live Streams.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined, and thank you for your time for this, I'm joined with David Douglas and correct me if I get this wrong, with Effective Law Enforcement for All. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
Thank you so much again for your time, Mr. Douglas. Now, can you
My
tell
pleasure.
me a little bit about yourself and tell me your background and what Effective Law Enforcement for All is?
Well, Effective Law Enforcement for All, and you'll hear me refer to it as Ele4a, is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to help the public and diverse communities work with their elected officials and police departments to achieve a shared vision, of policing that is safe and effective for the police and for the communities they serve. It arose out of my experience as the deputy consent decree monitor for the consent decree between the Department of Justice and the city of New Orleans calling for reform of its police department. At the time that decree was entered into, the Department of Justice called the New Orleans Police Department one of the most troubled big city police departments in the country. And now, after more than a decade later, this police department has really transformed. But along the way, I realized there was an opportunity to help communities and the police come together to work collaboratively to achieve a shared vision of policing without consent decrees. And basically that notion was consent decrees at their simplest are just a checklist of best policing practices. So the notion is we could use that checklist to educate the public as to what good policing looks like. And then that would allow them to go to their police department and compare its policies and its training to these best practices and work together to make changes where necessary.
Now, I want to say here in Louisville, Kentucky, again, there has not been a federal signing of the document, the consent decree, in this city, and many are fearing that it will be. But I want to ask you, what could holding this police department in this city, in this case LMPD and Louisville Metro, what could accountability actually look like with no federal oversight?
Well, let me actually give you an example. So in Montgomery County, Maryland, they decided to do a project voluntarily reimagining public safety. And they convened a public task force, members of the public, but also county agencies and other stakeholders. And they had a dialogue about what they wanted policing to look like. And we guided them through that dialogue. And we heard their thoughts, but we also contributed our expertise into policing practices, for example, behavioral health and things like that. So then this task force came up with a list of recommendations that it wanted for its police department and how it wanted policing to look like in Montgomery County. So then we went to the police department and we audited their practices. We looked at their policies. We looked at their training. We looked at some of their data and traffic stops and things. And then we compared what the task force wanted to best policing practices to what the Montgomery County Police Department was doing. And then we merged them and came up with a series of recommendations that reflected the desires of the community and best practices. And I think we generated 88 recommendations for change. And what was so gratifying about that is that the elected officials, the police department, the public task force, and even the union embraced our changes. So to answer the question, what could oversight look like? In that case, the oversight was the public task force and the reporting out to the public about what we had found, what we had recommended, and then they created a dashboard to track implementation of those changes. So essentially, the public was the oversight agency working through this task force.
Understood. And, in this city, there is the Civilian Review Board, who's led by the Inspector General, Ed Harness. And, in that capacity, there is the outcome of recommendations should a complaint be filed against Louisville Metro Police Department by a citizen here in Louisville. But I think more than anything, than the recommendations, people who have been aggrieved, people who have been accosted, and people who have been charged or unjustifiably so want justice. And
Sure.
the many things that I've seen, I've been mostly protesting, mostly activated since May 28th, 2020 in the city of Louisville. And I've seen so much on the street, in boardrooms, in meeting rooms, just all types of things. And I can see why people want this justice. And I wanted to ask you next, outside of these recommendations that have happened, what did the community involvement look like as it relates to forming these task forces, if you will? And I also wanted to ask you, how often was the community updated throughout that process?
Sure. Well, I think the task force arose from a variety of factors. There was a group here, a terrific grassroots organization, the Silver Spring Justice Coalition, that was responding to several shootings by Montgomery County Police of people who were having a mental health crisis, and they wanted a remedy for that. So they were a strong voice, and there were other strong voices, and so there was sort of very forward-looking leadership in the county that said, let's all come together and do this, before we have another problem or to address these concerns. So the impetus came from different sources, and then the public input really came through this task force, which was made up of really a cross-section of the community, different stakeholders. So they would convene, and then they would review the progress, they would track the implementation, and then along the way we would meet with other groups of people that have questions. So people had both the task force as their proxy, but then they had some opportunity for direct feedback. So for example, in consent decree work we've done, we've had public meetings where we update the public on the progress and on the challenges. So there are different ways that the public can have input in this process, direct and indirect.
Thank you so much, sir. We're going to take just a small break right now, and we're going to come right back and continue this discussion on consent decrees and what that could look like without the possibility of no federal oversight. Thank you so much for your time.
Through every note, every performance, the arts connect us. The arts connect us through joy and through awe, bridging cultures and generations. From intimate theaters to the grandest stages, the arts bring us together, reminding us that we're never truly alone. When we experience the arts, we experience each other. Kentucky Performing Arts. The arts connect us.
Now, thank you for your time again, Mr. Douglas. And once again, President of Effective Law Enforcement for All, yes?
Yes, sir.
Now, if anyone's just joining us right now, again, we're talking about the possibility, what could a consent decree and what could accountability look like with a consent decree with no federal oversight? As you know, again, anyone just tuning in, Donald Trump has stated a few different times that he is not in favor of consent decrees, and there's a possibility that the one in Louisville that is beckoning won't get signed. So again, we're talking with David Douglas, who's the president of Effective Law Enforcement for All. Now, I wanted to ask you one question, but I thought of another one, of a word you used earlier, which was stakeholders. For myself and others, can you define what a stakeholder is for me?
Well, I can, but I'm going to first confess to some sensitivity because I know some people, there's a history to that word that people don't like, but I confess it conveys something different than constituency, so I'll just be honest and tell you I struggle with the use of that word, but I haven't found another one that is widely understood. So we use it to mean people who have an interest or a role in a process. So if, in this context, certainly the police are stakeholders, the public are stakeholders. There are situations where somebody's just a witness. In this context, really the entire community has an interest in the process. So that's how I use it.
Understood. Now, I'll move on to my other question, the independent monitor. Now, it's not to assume that the independent monitor is just going to be one single person keeping track of an entire police force in a city and reporting back to the community, but it's a team, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Now, I'm assuming each individual city has its own energy, its own temperament, and its own team. Now, but overall, could you talk a little bit about what an independent monitoring team could and does look like?
Yes, let me first start with briefly the role of the monitor, because it's not just to monitor. They're called the monitor because in theory the city is making the changes and the monitor is reporting. But as important, maybe the more important role for monitor is to help a city implement the changes. Because the truth is the police department at issue doesn't really have experience with that process, but the monitoring team generally does. And so the team itself is configured to have policing experts to help articulate explain the requirements in the consent decree, to work with the police officers. What we really find is, because, for example, on our team, we have former chiefs, but they all started as, beat street officers. So they've really walked in the shoes of the officers that are subject to the consent decree. So they really can understand their experiences, their concerns. And that really helps them to form relationships conducive to driving change. So we have those. We have people like me. I'm not former police. I was a former civil rights prosecutor. I was a former community organizer. So we have a perspective on both civil rights in its legal sense, in its political sense, but also just community concerns. And then we also have some non-police subject matter experts, for example, in behavioral health. And sometimes we have academics to do studies and data. So it's generally a diverse team, and what we like is a team that really understands all aspects of the process. So, for example, in the work we're doing in Minneapolis, which can't say too much about under the terms of that agreement, our team consists of people like me who were monitors, but we also have people who were formerly with police departments that were being monitored. So we understand how the process looks and feels and works from both sides.
Now, again, you are not in Minneapolis, but you're in Washington, yes?
Suburbs of Washington, but I practice law in Washington.
Gotcha. And now, is there anything you can tell us or share with us with anything happening in Washington that may be affecting or may possibly affecting this consent decree process in the near future?
Well, we know from the president's executive order that he's directed the attorney general to review them all. He's made statements that he is clearly hostile to them. So we are expecting that the Department of Justice will move to terminate any pending consent decree agreements. Those, as in Louisville, that are not yet signed, and they may move to terminate others, but without getting into the legalese of it, if once a consent decree is signed, then the department would have to make a motion before the presiding judge to allow them to withdraw it. So that may make it a little bit different.
Now, federally, if that consent decree is canceled or closed by an executive order. And again, going microscopic here to this city, if one locally is formed, how does that affect that independent monitoring process? What does that look like exactly as it relates to, again, with no federal oversight? Is it the same thing, or is it a smaller version of it? I'll be as crude as to say a Kroger brand version of the federal version.
Well, I kind of like Kroger, but I don't know that I would say smaller. Here's what I would say. Here's what you lose. Certainly, you lose the judicial oversight and the power of a federal district judge to compel action by the parties or even the monitor. Mm-hmm. You also lose the Department of Justice as an oversight mechanism, and the Department of Justice also brings some expertise to the process. Mm-hmm. But the core elements of the agreement can still stay in place. They're just an agreement. And if that agreement calls for an independent monitor, it can still have an independent monitor. That monitor wouldn't have the force of a court behind it. But I'm a big believer that by reporting to the public and engaging the public in the process, the public can have a strong voice to ensure that the consent decree is implemented.
So in this case, is it safe to say or true to say that that independent monitoring team would then be only referring or reporting to the public or the community?
Well, generally they would report to the parties, so they would report to the city and the police department.
Of course.
I guess without a federal connect, so they would report to the city and the police department, and I guess the public, and maybe some established oversight body. One could be created of different that would represent different interests in the city, or maybe you mentioned a civilian oversight board. Maybe that's the board. So it would be good to have a body that it reports to in addition to the public at large.
Talk to me a little bit about the possibility or the capabilities, if you will, of a community. Let's say the possible, forgive me, the phrase you used is leaving my mind right now. I guess I'll ask it like this. What capabilities do community members have to structure what that independent monitoring looks like, that team looks like?
Well, I think that's probably largely a local decision or process, and there's no recognized established process for it. But most cities have a variety of organizations that have an interest in public safety. So when you think about it, policing, the police department, which is the focus of the consent decree, is really part of an overall public safety infrastructure, or a public safety network. For example, interacting with the behavioral health services or the jails, but also with nonprofit organizations and community groups. And in fact, one of the things we've done is we've created a community map where we're working in Minneapolis to help people understand all of the different organizations that have an involvement in this space. Mm-hmm. So you could replicate that, and you could survey those organizations and establish a board that has broad representation of it's I'm going to use the term from the left to the right. Probably not a good, but there's a spectrum of views about policing in any city, and it's important that full spectrum be represented. But you could establish an entity like that would then meet regularly with the monitor that would report to that board. And generally monitors issue written reports, and they have public meetings, set up a website. So there are all sorts of different ways for the monitor to get the information out concerning progress toward implementation, challenges, or problems. And where there are problems, the public can exert the right political pressure to make sure that they're addressed.
Making sure they're addressed, getting to the point of recommendations within the Louisville Metro or Louisville Metro Police Department in this case. But again, the accountability. Is it possible that, again, without the federal oversight, or could you see this, of course, because again, I understand it's different in every city, but sort of an agreement between the mayoral staff, the police department, and its community members, possibly something such as a memorandum of understanding, such as the consent decree stated, 2 years if these policies, if these reforms aren't met, then there would be federal repercussions. Possibly a memorandum of understanding between, again, the community or those teams, if you will, those groups who are reporting back and forth between the monitor and the groups, possibly a memorandum of understanding between the citizens and that police department. So if these things aren't met, then certain repercussions are to be had outside of recommendations that are a lot closer to accountable measures. Is that something that you see is far-fetched? Is that something that you see as doable?
Well, it's certainly doable, and I wouldn't call it far-fetched. Hard to know exactly how it might work. But let me say this, what we're really trying to do through these processes, this is really a restorative justice exercise. We are trying to repair bonds of trust that have been broken and to create bonds of trust where none existed. The role of the consent decree itself, the terms, is to lay out the elements of agreement between the city and the Department of Justice standing as a proxy for the public. So if you take out the Department of Justice, you can still have that agreement between the city and the public. And what we want this process to be is collaborative. And I think in that respect, there are even some benefits to doing it not without the force of Department of Justice consent decree, because it really can cause the police and the public to deeply engage about what they want. And what I've found over the years, working in New Orleans, working elsewhere, in many respects, that the police and the public sort of want the same things. A big barrier is just distrust and lack of communication, lack of understanding. That's why we work hard to educate the public. When should you chase a vehicle? When should you not? How should you use of force? What do you do when someone's having a mental health crisis? We want the public to be educated in what we know of as best practices policing. And sometimes the police don't know. And so we want to show them. And so we want them to work together to achieve very discrete kinds of goals. And those are the things laid out in consent decrees.
You know, some have stated that a consent decree is not the best answer in some regards because they stated that it would take the DOJ so long to catch up to what the community already knows are issues. And while they're figuring that out, they will continue living those woes, continue living those unjustifiable situations, which I continue to see myself in my days here in Louisville, Kentucky. Once again, you know, it's actually the consent decree process. It reminds me of something. And tell me if this is a little off and again, a little crude, but it reminds me of this scenario, or an analogy, if you will. The United States Department of Justice represented as a parent, and then they have two kids. One kid is Louisville Metro. The other child is Louisville Metro Police Department. And the parent says to the two kids, you've been in trouble. You've been acting up and you've been doing horrible things. You've been doing bad things. So you know what we're gonna do? You're grounded. And that grounding is a document. Let's call it the consent decree. And in that document of being grounded, they're to come home straight after school. They're to no video games. They're to your curfew's not 9:30 anymore, it's 6. And then for 2 years, if you don't abide by these things, then there's going to be further repercussions. But it seems to me without that federal oversight, those repercussions won't hold any strong ground. But there's also something else too that I think needs to be understood and stated, sort of a resolution. I'm thinking of the parent, in this case, again, with my analogy, the United States Department of Justice, making sure that the two kids understand why they got to this point, know how they got here, some sort of resolve is to say, and be accountable to say, hey, I did mess up. I understand how I messed up. And without that resolution, if you will, could the moving forward with that consent decree really be of the strongest and understood nature it possibly could? I want to say to the public that the Kentucky Alliance has formed a bit of a survey, and you can find it on their website at kentuckyalliance.org/survey. And in that, on that page, you can see the distinction between the consent decree resolution, the consent decree coalition, the People's Consent Decree Coalition, however. And please take that survey as well as the Kentucky Alliance has stated and made. But back to this interview, what do you think about that analogy, actually?
It's a good analogy, but let me just treat it directly in the context of investigations of consent decrees. Yeah,
Please.
There are some criticisms of these DOJ investigations. They do take a long time. They can take 2 years. And people say it takes the Department of Justice 2 years to figure out the things that the community has already known. And then there are 2 years of sort of criticizing the police department. So at the end of the process, the police department feels that it's been criticized. The truth is, if we all agree, if we just compare a police department's policies, training, and practices to what we now know as sort of 21st century best policing practices, it's not clear that you need to review the whole history of bad policing. You can really just say, let's move forward from here. So I guess to your analogy, it's as if the parents sort of yelled at the kids all through the academic year and then turned around the next year and said, okay, now we want to work with you to change it. Maybe we could cut out the first step and there's just an opportunity to move forward. And I know people think that this is not possible without a court order, but I disagree. Because in the first instance, as one of our experts says, there's no police officer in the country playing brutal cop. No 8-year-old kid in the country playing brutal cops and robbers. Police aren't born, they're made. They do what we teach them to do, train them to do, and hold them accountable for doing. So where society has failed is we've taken people who in the main, and I know there are some exceptions, who in the main become police officers to do the right thing, but then we do the right thing in the right way, but then we don't teach them how to do the right thing in the right way. And what we've certainly seen in New Orleans, for example, is that the officers in the main feel better about what has happened. There was great resistance there. But now, most of the officers, that I don't have any concerns that department will go backwards. So the short answer is, I think when you get into the process and work through the process, which does take time, you will find that in the main, the police and the public share the same goals. The real challenge is getting there and overcoming, years and years of mistrust and suspicion. But if you can push through that, I think you find change because the system will work better for everyone, even if you don't have a court order.
And that's the thing. I hear what you're saying, but I'll state that having seen so much of what I've seen and, being there on the ground with the steps that led to this consent decree to begin with, and so much pain and turmoil and death that's happened in between that process. I see how much need there is for this oversight and accountability. And it's something that, of course, I take very seriously and want to see to come to the best solution. And I think one part of that is, of course, the education and the awareness of community, and being able to have that ability to know what to do, know what to say. And that takes me back to the consent decree itself, the one that is attempted to be signed federally. There was no strong education of what was in that document, just the moving forward with it without letting community know, to a large scale anyway. Maybe we don't reach every single individual in the entire city, but at least more than 10%. But that's a story for another day. I guess I wanted to say, I hear what you're saying, of course, but just with the stories and what I've seen from my own experiences, there is a strong need for this accountability, I feel, and it needs to come, and it needs to happen sooner than later.
Well, I think the real question is, if there is no federal consent decree, what do you do?
Precisely.
So you still need to solve the problem. So your only solution then is sort of a more voluntary, collaborative process. And you're exactly right about everything that's happened. But the challenge, what I like to say is, public safety focused policing is really the undiscovered country. We haven't really seen it. We're aspiring to something we haven't seen, and that's hard to get people to trust that you can get there. And in the face of that uncertainty, people fall back on doubts and risks and the problems of the past. So the challenge is to help people understand, no, we can get there, and to use some of the successful models that we've seen to show people that, yes, if we all apply ourselves to this, we can come to a better place.
You know, when that we were talking, you were discussing earlier about the concept of, or the possibility of an MOU. You know, speaking solely for myself, only for myself, you know, I do feel that something like that, an agreement, if you will, that has an understanding and very bluntly stated, diversely stated, I should say, list of possible repercussions or accountability measures is necessary. Because like you said, what we have now are police. What we have now is the possibility of a consent decree with no federal oversight. So we have to do something, yes. And in my position, for me, in my heart, it's what can we as a community do to be involved in that process and not react to what was developed toward community.
Well, but isn't the consent decree, that could be your memorandum of understanding? You could add more opportunity for public input or public oversight. But in the absence of a federal consent decree, the existing agreement is essentially a memorandum of understanding. It's actually a little bit better, I would think, that because it's an agreement.
Now, the only hope is that, number one, let's say there's 300,000 people in this city, just hypothetically speaking. Number one, that to the best extent, we market that, hey, community, I'm sorry, let me take away the word we, that the city markets that, hey, community, we want you involved in the process of structuring out what this memorandum of understanding looks like. And then when hopefully as many people that want to hear it can hear it because it was well marketed, so those people come down and say, yes, I want to be a part of this process and hear my thought process. So you start these series of workshops and whatnot and developing what this memorandum of understanding looks like. But if that process is held back, if that process is not marketed to a wide percentage of people, then of course it's going to turn into something that doesn't really benefit a lot of people, if you will, to be able to be a part of that. That's what I'm afraid of, really.
I understand that, I guess. In just being practical, you have an agreement that's a pretty meticulously crafted, detailed document that could be your memorandum of understanding, so that rather than try and replicate that process, educate the public about what the current document has, because the city has already agreed to that. So create your workshops around explaining that document and how it will address some of the harms that have been experienced in the past.
And I agree with you, but there is something very distinctive that is stated in this city, that there's a desire to move forward with a consent decree. That hasn't been said that there's a desire to move forward with the consent decree. So there's just that word in general alone. There's a lot that can happen in two different ways just with that change of that word there. But Mr. Douglas, I have taken up a lot of your time, and I appreciate the time that you've given today. It's been educational and helpful. And I just want to ask you, before we do wrap up here, is there anything that you would like to share that possibly someone listening/watching needs or wants to hear that could be helpful?
I was going to say that effective law enforcement for all, our mission is to help the public lead the process of achieving the kinds of policing practices they want through education, through empowering them to engage with their city and their police department. So we believe that this process can work, and it's probably even more necessary now that there's not going to be a federal force in this area.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Douglas. And until next time, everyone, I hope you stay aware, stay safe. But if you do nothing else, stay live.
If you do nothing else.
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 Stay live.